The second point that I'd like to discuss is faith is continuously expecting. We are expecting for something would happen, that the promises of God would be delivered upon our lives. Now, let me read you again in verse 18, because this is a very powerful verse. In verse 18 it says, "Against all odds, when it looked hopeless, Abraham believed the promise and expected God to fulfill it." You know, God is a God of promises. He never lies, as we always know that. So that when He says something, it will always come to pass. So, what Abraham did when he heard about the promise of God to him, that he will be the father of many nations, he will have many descendants like sands in the sea. So, faith is continuously expecting. Now, in verse 18, let me highlight to you where it says, "Against all odds, when it looked hopeless." Have you realized the situation of Abraham? He was already old, 99. The promise that he would have children and all these many children was when he was 75 years old. And now he was already 99 years old and it's not happening yet. So there are so many odds, according to verse 18, against all odds. And when it looked hopeless, but Abraham continued to believe the promise and expected God to fulfill it. So it is very descriptive of what Abraham did while waiting for God's promise to happen. But you know, sometimes while waiting for God's will or God's promises to happen, trials are overwhelming and sometimes we stumble and fall. Like when we stumble and fall, we sort of skipping to pray, skipping to read the Bible, or not attending the church, whether online or on site. Abraham was no stranger to these things because he was a human being like us. So while Abraham was waiting but still expecting for God's promise to have a real son to happen, then he slept a little bit. Like, for example, he had no heir of his riches. So he offered his servant Eliezer to be heir of his estate. But God declined his offer and told him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir." And then he was already 99. Sarah was already 90 and barren, of course. And how could this happen? What happened was Sarah's plan to have a child like their own. She encouraged Abraham to sleep with Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, and we know the story that Ishmael was born. But that was not the promise of God. That is not the son that God is promising him, because Ishmael was the son of a slave girl, Hagar. But God is referring to the son of a free woman like Sarah. So through all these slips and falls that had happened in the life of Abraham, he kept expecting for God's promise. Now let me read to you Romans 14:19, the continuation of our text. In spite of being nearly 100 years old, when the promise of having a son was made, his faith was so strong that it could not be undermined by the fact that he and Sarah were incapable of conceiving a child. He never stopped believing God's promise, for he made strong in his faith to father a child. And so we know that Isaac was born later on. Now, in verse 22 of our text, it says in there, let me highlight that again, and because he was mighty in faith. I like that phrase. Abraham was mighty in faith. And let's make him as our model to be a man of mighty in faith, and convinced that God had all the power needed to fulfill his promises. So therefore, Abraham glorified God. That is very exciting, because his faith in God was continuously believing and expecting, and his faith is mighty in the Lord. Then when the promise was delivered, when Isaac was born, then it says in verse 22, Abraham glorified God. So all the glory be to the Father, because the promise was already delivered. Now let me read to you the other translation of verse 22, which is from NIV, New International Version. And it says, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. So he was fully convinced, he was fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. There you go, brothers and sisters. In spite of the fact that we are in this situation at the moment, then we should be continuously believing and expecting that all those beautiful promises of God are going to be delivered in our own life, in our family, in our community, in our country, and all over the world. So when we continue believing and expecting God's promises to happen, it would lead to worshiping and glorifying God, just like what Abraham did. God bless you all. Thank you for joining us.